A mystery that has puzzled music psychologists for centuries is what it means to understand music. We cannot shake off the impression that music speaks to us and conveys messages to us. The feeling that musical figures have a meaning can be explained psychologically. One credible explanatory model is the so-called attribution theory. It assumes that we suspect a person and an intention behind all movements and changes in the world. This also applies to the visual domain. If we observe two moving shapes, for example, we immediately suspect an interaction, in this case probably an aggressor and a defensive behavior. Because music is structured very similarly to spoken language, we assume that someone wants to speak to us through it. But there are other ways to understand music. To do this, we need to remember what the basic characteristics of language are. Languages can be understood as relations between structures. Our human language establishes relationships between sound utterances or drawn symbols and facts in the outside world. The sound utterance or the inscription "Alice is sitting on the bench" is assigned to a situation in which Alice is sitting on a particular bench. The way in which utterances and situations are connected can be very complex. The idea that language provides images of the real world doesn't go sufficiently far. However, I do not want to go into this in detail. Above all, it is important to realize that the listener of the utterance is only able to make the connection between the utterance and the situation if he is aware of certain conventions. He must know, for example, that the reference of bench is a bench, and that the utterance can be broken down into a noun phrase, Alice, and a verb phrase, sits on the bench. Understanding of verbal language, therefore, means knowing how it links different domains together. And we need to be able to decide whether the assertions made in the language are correct. Knowledge of language enables us to decide whether its sentences are true or false. Now, what about music in terms of language similarity? A writer observes the real world and creates a verbal image of the real world. A painter observes the real world and creates a visual image of the real world. Interestingly, the musician takes the opposite approach. He reads a musical text, in other words an image, and uses it to create the real world, namely the music. So what are the relationships between structures that characterize music? The musical text is one of them. The ability to read the musical text and assign musical elements to its components is a form of understanding. We know what the notes, staves, beams, accidentals, and so on refer to and what kind of musical situation they describe. In the case of reading score music, we also have a kind of truth criterion. We can decide whether the music we play corresponds to the musical text or not. But music can also be linked to emotional states. However, these pairings do not follow our understanding of emotions in the real world. Our everyday understanding of emotions is intentional. We recognize emotions on the basis of a carrier or an object at which they are aimed. We recognize the fear that someone has of a snarling dog or humiliation and not simply fear. We recognize the envy of the unsuccessful against the winner and not simply envy. But the latter is precisely the case with regard to musical structures. They are connected with emotional structures per se, without carriers or objects. There are structures, for example rapid, rhythmic movements in major keys and wide interval leaps, which have the characteristics of joy. In other words, they depict qualities that characterize people who express emotions. So we do not recognize in music the joy of a high profit, a pleasing message and so on, but merely characteristics of rejoicing. And there it is also pointless to speak of truth. So what does it mean to understand music? Understanding music seems to be a complex set of different skills, knowing how to translate musical notation or standardized verbal instructions into sound. This also includes the ability to correctly connect musical objects, for example harmonies, with their description in theoretical concepts. For example, naming a C major chord as a C major chord. But it can also include more complex relationships, for example the assignment of musical sequences to characteristics of emotions. Mythological tales suggest that there is also a link between music and the nature of the real world. For example, the Pythagoreans' harmony of the spheres or Schopenhauer's conviction that music opens the door to the otherwise hidden deepest truths. I believe that there can be no such metaphysical connection between music and the outside world. At most, musical structures can only refer to other musical structures via similarity relations. This was the conviction of the music theorist Eduard Hanslick. His influential essay on the beautiful in music still seems modern today. Hanslick was the counterpart to Richard Wagner, who charged music with meaning. Wagner mocked Hanslick as Sixtus Beckmesser in his opera The Master Singers of Nuremberg. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel. At academia-larty.org, you will also find a knowledge database and online courses from our academy. And check out the other videos here on YouTube. Thank you for your interest.